Welcome to Luke's Stories, where camping isn't all about campfires and stars, but also nightmares in the dark. My name is Jacob Martin, and this happened back in 1999, out near the ragged coastline of Maine. I had this idea of finding some peace, so I borrowed my uncle's RV for the summer, thinking I'd get some fresh air, recharge from life. I figured I'd get in some solo time, a few fishing trips, some quiet nights. That's how I ended up at a park near Black Harbour, a little nowhere town that didn't even get cell reception back then. This wasn't a famous national park, or even one of those scenic overlooks that people make pilgrimages to. It was just woods, rough and thick, fading into a rocky coastline that nobody seemed to care about. I was a few days into my quiet escape, living off canned beans on a half-empty propane stove that hissed with a little too much attitude for my taste. The most exciting part of my day was waiting for the rain to pass so I could take out my fishing rod. I didn't expect much more than sea salt air and seagulls. It was halfway through my fourth day, sometime in the late afternoon, that I heard what I figured must be kids from the local town messing around. The voices were faint, echoing through the woods in some distant way that made it hard to place them. I thought about walking down to see what was going on, maybe throwing a rock or two to scare them off if they got too close, but I didn't think much of it. By evening, though, something had shifted. I heard footsteps, not the quick, careless crunch of sneakers, but deliberate, slow steps. I was in the RV scratching down a grocery list of things I'd need on my next trip back to town when I caught the sound. It was steady, creeping up around the corner of the RV. It hit me that I hadn't seen another soul out here since I'd arrived, and that didn't sit right. I mean, who comes out to this kind of place aside from someone with a taste for quiet or trouble? I kept still, waiting for the person to pass or show themselves, but there was only the slow, shuffling drag of footsteps. I tried to listen for the sound of multiple feet or voices, but it was dead silent except for that single shuffle. Against my better judgment, I opened the RV door and stepped outside. Nothing, just trees swaying in the evening light. But my instinct told me to keep quiet. I could still feel something out there, hiding, the kind of presence that prickles the hair on your neck and makes you regret stepping out of safety. I stayed there, scanning the tree line, listening. I almost thought I'd imagined it until I spotted something strange, half hidden between the trees. A figure, still as stone, facing away from me. The guy looked like he was part of the forest itself, cloaked in grime, with torn, mud-stained clothes hanging off him like a loose second skin. He didn't move, he didn't breathe, just stood there as if rooted to the ground. Now, I don't scare easy, but something about this man felt like a bad omen. I cleared my throat, thinking maybe he was some lost hiker or drifter, but he didn't flinch. Didn't even look at me. Finally, I called out something casual, like asking if he needed directions. Still nothing. After a long moment, he turned, slow, like he was trying to remember how to move. His face was something I'll never forget, but not because it was scary exactly. It was hollow, if that makes any sense. This blank expression, like he'd forgotten what it meant to be human. He took a step forward, just one, like he was testing the ground. I backed up so fast I almost tripped. I tried to laugh it off, told myself he was just some messed-up camper. But the way he looked at me, it was like he wasn't looking at me at all, just through me. I ducked back into the RV, my heart racing, and locked the door. It felt stupid locking up, but something about him felt off, like he wasn't just some regular guy lost in the woods. I figured he'd wander off, but minutes later I heard him shuffling again, this time closer to the RV. I looked out the window and saw him standing right there, not more than 10 feet away. His face twisted into this deadpan stare that sent a chill down my spine. Then came the whispering. Low, muttering sounds, barely audible, like he was talking to someone only he could hear. At first I thought he was addressing me, but then I realized he wasn't looking at the RV at all. His head tilted, and he mumbled something about payment and lost souls. The words were scattered, fragmented, like someone trying to piece together a broken sentence. I sat there, watching him, my heart pounding so loud I thought he'd hear it, but he just kept muttering, almost in a trance. At that point, I was just about ready to pack it up and find somewhere else to park. I reached for my bag, ready to throw some stuff together when the RV suddenly rocked. I heard metal groaning, and something slammed into the side with a force that shook the whole rig. I was paralyzed for a second, gripping the edge of the table as the guy outside went silent. All I could hear was his breathing, loud and ragged, against the thin walls of the RV. I heard a scratching sound, nails or something, scraping along the side, followed by a soft thud, as if he was testing the edges, feeling out the RV like it was some sort of animal he was trying to corner. I kept still, my back pressed against the wall, listening to every sound. I'd never felt fear like that, this primal kind of terror that kicks in when you realize you're trapped. The scratching stopped, and in the silence that followed, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps receding. I took a breath, thinking maybe he'd finally left, but then I smelled something foul. It was a metallic, rotten scent that crept through the vents, filling the air inside with a stench so bad it turned my stomach. I gagged, covering my nose, and nearly bolted for the door. Before I could, I heard him speak again, his voice low and guttural. This time, he muttered louder, "Must be paid." I froze, not sure if he was talking to himself or if he was giving some kind of twisted warning. Either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I grabbed my bag and edged toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to get out of there. I took a quick look through the window and saw him walking away, his figure disappearing into the trees. I bolted, taking off through the woods in the opposite direction. The sound of his footsteps echoed somewhere behind me, and for a moment, I thought I could hear him muttering again. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I'd cleared the tree line and hit the gravel road. My feet ached and my lungs burned, but I didn't care. I just kept running, putting as much distance as I could between me and that place. Hours later, I found a small gas station by the highway and told the cashier everything. He gave me this look like he'd heard it before, then mumbled something about an old man who'd gone crazy years ago, back when the town was still booming. He said the guy used to wander the woods, talking to himself about debts and payments, claiming to be some sort of collector. Local legend had it that he went mad after his family drowned in a storm. The story was that he'd gone feral, taking to the woods, driven by some twisted sense of revenge or justice. I don't know if I believe in all that. All I know is that I saw him, heard him, and every time I think of that muttering, "Debt must be paid," I feel a chill that doesn't fade. I don't know who he thought I was or what debt he imagined I owed, but I'll tell you one thing. I'm never setting foot near Black Harbor again. Some debts you just don't pay. When I left the city, I was desperate for peace, after a messy divorce and years spent staring at screens. I wanted silence, real silence, not the muffled hum of traffic or the constant buzz of electronics, but the quiet only nature could offer. That's how I ended up in Mohun State Park, alone in my old RV, parked on the edge of the Clear Fork Gorge. The park was stunning, especially in the late afternoon light. Trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their leaves a tapestry of green and gold. The air smelled clean, untouched by asphalt or fumes. It was perfect, at least at first. The first day was uneventful. I hiked the main trails, snapping a few photos with my phone, and spent the evening cooking a simple meal on my RV's small stove. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a rare kind of contentment. This was what I needed. No emails, no ex-wife, no one telling me what to do or who to be. Just me in the woods. But by the second day, things began to feel off. It started when I noticed the trail. I'd been walking back to my RV after a long hike when I spotted it. A faint path branching off the main one, almost hidden by overgrown bushes. It was narrow, barely more than a line of packed dirt, and it twisted sharply into the woods. Something about it tugged at me. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I was just tired of the predictability of the main trails. Whatever it was, I stepped off the beaten path and onto the faint trail. The air felt different as I walked, heavier, quieter. The usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling, seemed muted, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. After a few minutes, I found the ruins. At first I thought it was just a pile of rocks, but as I got closer, I saw the remains of a chimney and the rotting beams of what must have been a small cabin. A rusted metal lantern sat in the dirt, its handle broken. The ground was littered with shards of pottery and what looked like animal bones. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. Someone lived out here, I muttered to myself. The idea seemed impossible. This part of the park was miles from any road, and the trail was nearly invisible. Why would anyone build a cabin here? I snapped a photo and turned back toward the RV, eager to put the strange scene behind me. That night, the noises started. I had just crawled into bed when I heard it, a faint snapping sound like someone stepping on a twig. I froze, my heart pounding. Raccoons, I told myself, or maybe deer. I wasn't exactly deep in the wilderness, so wildlife was normal. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to an animal. They circled the RV, crunching the dry leaves and stopping occasionally, as if whoever or whatever was out there was listening. I grabbed my flashlight and swung open the door, shining the beam into the trees. "Hello?" I called, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Is someone out there?" The forest stared back at me, silent and empty. After a few minutes, I retreated inside, locking the door and double-checking the windows. Eventually, the footsteps faded, and I convinced myself it was just a hiker passing through. Nothing to worry about. The next morning, I stopped by the visitor center to report the strange noises. Leah, the park guide on duty, greeted me with a friendly smile, but it faltered when I described what I'd heard. "You were near the old trapper's cabin, weren't you?" she asked, her voice low. I blinked. "Trapper's cabin," she nodded. "It's an old story. Back in the early 1900s, a man built a cabin deep in the woods, far from anyone else. They say he was reclusive, didn't trust people. One day he just vanished. No one knows what happened, but some locals think his ghost still wanders the forest." I couldn't help but laugh. "Ghosts, come on." Leah shrugged. "Believe what you want, but I'd stay away from that area if I were you. People say the forest gets strange near the cabin." I left the visitor center feeling annoyed. Ghost stories were fine for campfire entertainment, but I wasn't about to let a local legend ruin my weekend. That night, the disturbances grew worse. I was halfway through dinner when the lights in the RV flickered and went out. I swore under my breath, grabbing a flashlight to check the breaker. As I fumbled with the panel, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time, circling the RV like a predator sizing up its prey. The flashlight beam caught something on the ground. Footprints. Human footprints. Large and deep, as if whoever made them was heavy. My breath caught in my throat. "Okay," I muttered, trying to steady myself. "Someone's messing with me." Grabbing my hiking boots, I stepped outside, determined to confront whoever was out there. But the second I stepped into the clearing, the forest fell silent. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness that pressed against my ears. That's when I saw the first figure. It was pale and thin, barely more than a shadow against the trees. It stood perfectly still, its face obscured by darkness. Then it moved, not toward me, but away, disappearing into the woods without a sound. I didn't follow. Instead, I locked myself in the RV, sat by the window, gripping a kitchen knife, and watched the forest until dawn. By the time the sun rose, I'd made up my mind. I had to go back to the cabin. I needed answers. The trail felt even more oppressive in the daylight. The air was thick, and the silence was absolute. When I reached the clearing, I saw something I hadn't noticed before, a small rusted knife lying in the dirt. Next to it was a notebook, its cover warped with age. I picked it up carefully, flipping through the yellowed pages. Most of the writing was illegible, but a few sentences stood out, scrawled in jagged letters. "It watches from the trees. Don't disturb the woods. The forest is alive." A chill ran down my spine as I turned to leave. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, the dirt rippling like water. The trees creaked, their branches twisting unnaturally, and then I felt it. A presence. Something unseen, massive and ancient, watching me from every direction. I ran. The RV was my only sanctuary, but even there I wasn't safe. The lights flickered, the floor trembled, and the air grew thick with the stench of damp earth. Through the window I saw the pale figure again, joined by others, shadows slipping between the trees, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The ground beneath the RV began to groan, roots writhing like snakes. I turned the key in the ignition, praying the engine would start. It roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas. As the RV lurched forward, the figures began to move, their blank faces turning toward me. The roots clawed at the tires, but the momentum was enough to break free. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest shrinking in my rearview mirror. I never went back to Mohan State Park. Whatever was in those woods, it didn't want me there, and I was more than happy to stay away. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of the forest. I hear footsteps outside my window, and I swear I can feel its eyes on me. The forest doesn't forget, and neither do I. My name is Stephen Ramirez, and I'm 39 years old. This happened last fall when I decided to take my first solo RV trip to Spruce Knob Lake in West Virginia. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a way to escape the wreckage of my divorce and prove to myself that I could handle life on my own. I was tired of feeling like a failure, and this trip was my attempt at reclaiming some confidence. Looking back, I realize how naive I was. The forest doesn't care about your pride. I pulled into the campground late in the afternoon. The drive had been longer than expected, thanks to winding mountain roads and a temperamental GPS that insisted I make turns onto non-existent paths. Spruce Knob Lake lay in a valley surrounded by dense forest, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. Before heading to the lake, I stopped at a small gas station on the edge of town to fill up and grab a few snacks. The attendant was an old woman with grey hair pinned in a tight bun. Her eyes had the kind of intensity that made you feel exposed. "Heading to Spruce Knob, huh?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "A couple of days by the lake should be peaceful." Her expression darkened. "Don't go wandering the woods after dark, and if you see a lantern, you turn the other way." "A lantern?" I chuckled nervously, hoping to break the tension. "I'll keep that in mind." But as I drove away, her words lingered in my mind. By the time I reached the campground, the sun was dipping below the tree line. I parked the RV near the edge of the lake and set up a basic campsite. My gear was minimal: a rented stove, a second-hand flashlight, and a cheap folding chair that creaked every time I shifted my weight. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound, the rustle of leaves, the soft lap of water against the shore, the occasional groan of the wind through the trees. Around 9 p.m., as I was reading by the dim glow of my lantern, I noticed something strange, a flickering light in the woods across the lake. It wasn't the steady beam of a flashlight or the glow of a campfire. It moved erratically, like an old oil lantern swaying in someone's hand. At first, I thought it might be another camper, but the more I watched, the more unsettling it became. The light moved deeper into the trees, then stopped, then blinked out. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But that night, as I tried to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there watching. The next morning, I decided to explore one of the trails that looped around the lake. The air was crisp, the leaves a vibrant mix of red and gold, and for a while, I felt like I'd made the right choice coming here. About an hour into my hike, I heard it, soft, rhythmic giggling, a child's laughter coming from somewhere ahead. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. No response. As I rounded a bend, I saw her, a little girl sitting on a rock by the trail. She looked about 10 years old with dark hair and a pale face. She was wearing old-fashioned clothes, a long skirt and a cardigan that seemed out of place. "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping closer. She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on something in the distance. "Are you lost?" I tried again. She turned her head slightly, just enough to look at me out of the corner of her eye. Then she stood and walked into the forest without a word. "Wait," I called, hurrying after her. But when I reached the spot where she disappeared, there was no sign of her, just a muddy child's shoe sitting on the ground. By the time I got back to the RV, the clouds had rolled in, turning the afternoon grey and heavy. I tried to push the encounter with the girl out of my mind, telling myself it was just a weird coincidence. Maybe she was a local kid playing in the woods. That night, things got worse. The electrical system in the RV started acting up. The lights flickered erratically, and the radio turned on by itself, blasting static. My flashlight died, even though I'd just put in fresh batteries. I lit my lantern for some semblance of control, but the flame cast dancing shadows on the walls that made the RV feel smaller, more claustrophobic. Then came the sound of footsteps. They circled the RV, slow and deliberate. I peered out the window but saw nothing. Still, the sound continued, crunching leaves and snapping twigs just outside. I locked the door and sat on the bed, gripping a kitchen knife I'd brought for cooking. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, the silence was almost worse. Then a voice broke the stillness. "Stephen," it said. A child's voice. Against every instinct, I opened the door. The forest beyond was shrouded in darkness, but there it was again, the flickering light. The lantern hovered at the edge of the woods, swaying gently as if beckoning me closer. And then I saw her, the little girl, standing beneath the light. "Help me," she whispered, her voice carrying through the still air. I stepped out of the RV. My legs moved almost against my will. The lantern retreated into the forest, and I followed the girl's figure, always just out of reach. The trail grew steeper and more treacherous, the ground soft and uneven beneath my boots. The lantern led me to the edge of a ravine, its rocky walls plunging into darkness. At the bottom, I saw something glinting, a small mirror, cracked and streaked with dirt. The little girl stood beside it, her pale face illuminated by the lantern's eerie glow. "Jump," she said softly. "What?" I stammered, my voice trembling. "You have to jump," she repeated. Her voice wasn't pleading anymore, it was cold, commanding. I looked down at the ravine, at the jagged rocks below. The lantern hovered above the abyss, flickering like it was waiting for me to obey. Something in me snapped. "No," I said, my voice firm. The girl's face twisted into something monstrous. Her eyes darkened, and her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "You don't get to choose," she hissed, her voice no longer human. I reached into my bag and pulled out my journal, the one thing I'd brought to document my journey to rediscover myself. Without hesitation, I hurled it into the ravine. The lantern flared violently, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. The girl screamed, a sound that seemed to tear through the fabric of the night, and then she and the lantern vanished. I stumbled back to the RV, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The electrical system was working again, the lights steady, and the radio silent. I packed up and left before the sun rose, driving until I was miles away from Spruce Knob Lake. A week later, I found something waiting for me in my apartment. Sitting on the kitchen counter was an old oil lantern, its glass cracked and filled with ash. When I picked it up, I heard its soft rhythmic giggling echoing from somewhere deep inside. I haven't camped since. The wilderness isn't always what it seems. Sometimes it's better to stay lost in the chaos of the city than risk finding what waits in the silence of the woods. My name is Brandon Stevens, and this happened to me back in 2005 while camping in Mount Rainier National Park. I'd borrowed my cousin's RV for the first time. He said I was due for some real scenery therapy, as he called it, away from the stress and noise of the city. I'd just wrapped up a divorce, and my mind was cluttered. Nature felt like a good reset button. I set up at Cougar Rock Campground, a secluded part of the park with tall pines and a stream that burbled quietly just out of sight, peaceful, until the silence starts creeping up on you. The kind of silence that makes every sound, like a twig snapping or water trickling, sound 10 times louder. I parked the RV near the forest's edge, half a mile from the nearest camper, figuring the solitude would be good for me, little human interaction, a little more staring at clouds and mountains. Around mid-afternoon, I met another camper. His name was Russell, an older guy with a scraggly beard and a perpetual frown. He told me he'd been camping there for years, always alone. He said he liked the solitude, the natural rhythm of the place, whatever that meant. He had this rough way of talking, every word thick like he was chewing on gravel. Friendly enough, though, and I thought it was kind of nice to have a fellow loner around. We talked a bit about the area, and then he mentioned something about strange folks drifting into the park lately, people who didn't seem to belong, as he put it. I shrugged it off, but I did notice that Russell's campsite was a mess, with empty cans and old camping gear scattered around like he'd set up for the long haul. I got this off feeling, like he wasn't there just for the peace and quiet, but I brushed it off. Guy was a stranger in the woods, no more, no less. By sundown, I was back at my RV, thinking a quick dinner of instant noodles would do just fine. I cranked up the little camping stove, ate in silence, then decided to go for a short walk by the water, flashlight in hand. The stream was a faint line of silver under the moonlight, but everything else had fallen into darkness. I'd taken just a few steps when I saw someone else on the trail, not Russell. This guy was tall, with wild hair, clothes that were patched and frayed, and a scar that ran from his left cheek down to his neck. I gave him a nod, the casual keep-your-distance nod people give in the wilderness. He didn't respond, just stared back, his eyes lingering a bit too long. I kept walking, but I could feel his gaze following me. It was like the guy was sizing me up. Back at my RV, I locked the door and made sure the windows were secure. I just settled in to get some sleep when I heard footsteps, light ones at first, like someone trying not to be heard. I thought maybe it was Russell. Maybe he'd had a bit too much of whatever he was drinking by the fire earlier. So I ignored it, but then the footsteps grew louder, then stopped right by the side of the RV. A minute later, there was a light knock on the door. I froze, listening, my mind racing through who it could be. No one else was around, not this late. I ignored it, hoping whoever it was would take the hint. But then came another knock, louder this time. I crept up to the small window by the door and peered out, just enough to catch a glimpse. It was the scarred man from earlier. He was standing there, his head tilted, a sick smile stretching his mouth like he'd found exactly what he was looking for. I forced myself to breathe slowly to keep calm. I hadn't brought a gun, something I was seriously regretting at this point, but the guy hadn't seen me yet. Maybe he'd just leave if I stayed quiet. Then, in a voice just loud enough to cut through the walls, he said, "Hey, Brandon, I know you're in there." The blood drained from my face. How the hell did he know my name? I didn't remember mentioning it to anyone except Russell, and even then it was in passing. My mind scrambled through every option. Stay silent, open the door and try to talk him down, or grab something heavy and defend myself. I reached for a frying pan, the heaviest thing within arm's reach. Not exactly a weapon, but better than nothing. I crept toward the door, thinking maybe I could give him a hard enough swing to make him rethink his plans. But just as I was about to take a breath and steady myself, the guy pounded on the door with enough force to shake the whole RV. "Brandon, open up. I'm not leaving until we talk," he said, his tone calm, like he was asking for a cup of sugar instead of trying to break into my camper. Then I heard it. A scraping sound, like metal against metal. I looked down and saw a thin blade, maybe a pocket knife, slowly working its way through the RV door lock. A wave of panic surged through me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I pushed against the door as hard as I could, holding it in place with my weight. The blade slipped, and I heard him curse under his breath. For a second, I thought maybe I'd scared him off. But then the guy's face appeared in the window, eyeing me with a mix of annoyance and amusement. "You don't make this easy, do you?" he muttered. I must have looked terrified, because he laughed, low and hollow. He tapped the window, pointing at me like I was a bug in a jar. That's when I caught the movement behind him, a dark figure moving out of the tree line, slowly, deliberately. Russell. He must have heard the noise and come over to check things out. Russell didn't say a word. He just stood there watching. For a second, I thought he was going to help me, that he'd scare this guy off. But he didn't. He just watched, his face expressionless as the guy kept trying to force his way in. I pounded on the window, yelling for him to help, to do something, but he stood there unmoved. And then I realized it. Russell was in on it. Suddenly, I was a trapped animal. The frying pan felt absurd in my hands, 2 against 1, and I was stuck inside a fiberglass cage. There was no way I'd make it if they got in. My only shot was to run. I dropped the pan, shoved open the emergency hatch in the roof, and scrambled up. The cold air bit against my face. I heard them both cursing below as I climbed, stumbling over myself in the darkness. I was barefoot, the sharp gravel digging into my feet as I ran for the tree line, heart hammering like a drum. The RV was small, but in that moment it felt like an ocean between me and those 2 maniacs. I didn't stop to look back. I just kept running. Eventually, I reached the ranger station, my feet bloody, my body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. They found Russell and his friend later that night, hiding out near the campsite with a whole stash of stolen camping gear and weapons. Turns out they'd been robbing campers for months, using the park's seclusion to get away with it. In the end, Russell claimed he'd just been there by coincidence when the scarred guy attacked me. But the scarred man wasn't so lucky. After a short scuffle with the cops, he was arrested with enough evidence of his outdoor exploits to keep him locked up for life. It turned out he had a habit, finding interesting campers to mess with, using the solitude of the park as his own twisted playground. That's what went down that night at Mount Rainier, and I still don't know what Russell's deal was, whether he was in on it from the start, or just a bystander too afraid to stand up. But one thing's for sure, I'll never be borrowing an RV for scenery therapy again. I didn't choose Shawnee State Forest because of its history or reputation. In fact, I knew nothing about it when I arrived. It was just a green blob on the map, far from cities, noise, and people, exactly what I needed after 40 years of working as a nurse. Most of that time was spent caring for others, and now I wanted to care for myself. The RV was my little rebellion, my escape pod. It wasn't much. An old model with a sagging mattress and a stove that only worked half the time. But it was freedom on wheels. That's how I ended up parked on a secluded patch of dirt in the shadow of Shawnee's towering oaks. The first 2 days were blissfully uneventful. I spent my time hiking, sketching birds, and letting the sounds of the forest wash over me. Every now and then I'd pass another hiker or see a ranger's truck rumble down the trail, but for the most part, I was alone. On the 3rd day, while exploring a new trail, I noticed an overgrown path branching off into the woods. A massive oak tree marked the entrance, its trunk carved with strange looping symbols. Curiosity tugged at me. I almost walked past it, but something about the tree and the path beyond drew me in. The air changed as I stepped onto the narrow trail, cooler and heavier. The birdsong quieted, leaving only the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional creak of branches overhead. The path led to a small clearing where I found the remains of what must have been a settlement. The outlines of old foundations peeked through the moss, and a collapsed well sat in the center, surrounded by a ring of stones. Hanging from the trees were crude wooden figures, effigies, I realized, made from sticks and string. A chill ran down my spine. This must be one of those ghost towns, I muttered aloud, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. I turned back toward the main trail, shaking off the eerie feeling, but I couldn't quite forget the carvings on the tree or those strange wooden figures. That night I was jolted awake by a faint whispering sound. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I listened I realized it was something else. The voices were soft, high-pitched, like children murmuring, just outside the RV. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. The whispering stopped. I fumbled for my flashlight and aimed it through the window. The beam caught the trees swaying gently in the breeze, but there was nothing else out there. Still, I locked the door and double-checked the windows before climbing back into bed. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream, or maybe an animal. To prove to myself that I wasn't afraid, I hiked back to the strange path and followed it to the clearing again. Nothing had changed except for one thing. The oak tree at the entrance had new carvings on it, fresh ones. They weren't the looping symbols I'd seen before, but crude shapes that resembled stick figures. I pressed my fingers to the bark. The lines were shallow, as though they'd been made recently. "Okay, Beth," I said aloud, "you're freaking yourself out." But as I turned to leave, I saw a figure standing in the clearing, a child. At least I thought it was a child. It was pale and small, with dark eyes that seemed too large for its face. "Hey," I called. "Are you okay? Are you lost?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, staring at me. I took a cautious step forward, and it darted into the trees, moving so quickly that I couldn't see where it went. I chased after it, calling out, but within seconds I'd lost the trail. I was alone again. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, coming from every direction. I sat frozen in the RV, clutching my flashlight, too scared to move. Then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. I waited, straining my ears. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came from under the RV, like something or someone was scratching at the chassis. I climbed out of bed, my knees trembling, and crept toward the door. "Who's out there?" I called. The tapping stopped. When I finally mustered the courage to open the door, I found nothing but darkness and the faint rustle of leaves. The next day, I decided to leave. I told myself it was just paranoia, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Before I left, I stopped by the ranger station to let someone know about the strange carvings and the child I'd seen. The man behind the desk, Paul, looked up from his paperwork and frowned. "You were at the old clearing?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Why?" He scratched his head. "That place has been abandoned for a long time. People around here say it's cursed, but it's probably just stories." "What kind of stories?" He shrugged. "Settlers vanished from that area back in the 1800s. Some say they were killed, others say they just left. But there's this legend that the forest takes people, lures them in." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "You don't really believe that, do you?" Paul didn't answer. That evening, as I packed up my things, the whispers started again. This time they weren't outside, they were inside the RV. I spun around, shining my flashlight, but the small space was empty. "Leave," a voice whispered. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. "Who's there?" I shouted. The voice didn't answer, but the RV began to shake. The floor trembled beneath my feet, and the lights flickered. Suddenly, the pale figure of the child appeared at the window. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. "Please," the figure whispered, "you have to leave." Before I could respond, it vanished. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I started the RV and drove toward the exit as fast as I could. The forest blurred past me, and I felt a flicker of hope that I'd escape unscathed. Then the road disappeared. One moment I was following the dirt path, and the next, it was gone. I slammed on the brakes. The RV skidded to a stop. The forest loomed around me, the trees seeming closer than before. And then I saw them, dozens of shadowy figures standing between the trees, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The ground beneath the RV began to tremble. I looked down and saw roots writhing like snakes creeping toward the tires. "No," I whispered. "This isn't real." The roots coiled around the RV, pulling it downward. I slammed the accelerator, but the wheels spun uselessly. The figures stepped closer, their faces blank and featureless. I screamed, closing my eyes and gripping the steering wheel, waiting for the end. When I opened my eyes, I was sitting in a clearing. The RV was intact, the engine still running. The forest was silent. I didn't wait to question what had happened. I drove straight out of Shawnee State Forest and never looked back. Even now, months later, I still hear whispers, sometimes soft and faint, like leaves rustling in the wind. And I know the forest hasn't forgotten me. My name is Sarah Mosby, and I'm 35 years old. This happened just last autumn, when the leaves in Dolly Sod's wilderness were fiery red, and the air had the first chill of winter. I had driven my RV into the Monongahela National Forest for a week of solitude and inspiration. As a freelance travel writer, I'd made a career out of escaping the noise of the city. But this time, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. I was there to write about the beauty of isolation, about finding yourself in the wild. What I found instead was something I still struggle to explain, something that won't leave me alone, even now. The Dolly Sods trailhead was quiet when I arrived. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for an old pickup truck and a battered camper. I parked my RV, loaded my gear, and set out to scout the area. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, but the stillness was uncanny. There weren't any birds singing, no rustle of squirrels in the underbrush, just the crunch of my boots and the soft hum of the breeze. As I checked my map, an older man emerged from the trail. He was gruff-looking, with a weathered face and a hiking stick worn smooth by years of use. His name, I learned, was Bill. He gave me a long, assessing look before speaking. "Dolly Sods can be tricky," he said, his voice grave. "Stay on the marked trails. Don't wander off, and don't let the quiet fool you. It's not always empty out there." I laughed nervously. "Thanks for the advice, but I've done this a lot. I'll be fine." He didn't laugh. "The forest knows when you're alone," he said, then walked away without another word. I hiked out a few miles and found the perfect spot to set up camp. My RV was parked at the edge of the lot for the night, so this was just a scouting trip. The clearing I chose was beautiful, framed by skeletal trees with red leaves fluttering like whispers. I pitched my tent, pulled out my notebook, and started jotting down ideas for my article. That's when I saw her, a girl maybe 16, sitting on a rock near the creek. She was dressed oddly in a long skirt and a faded cardigan, her dark hair falling over her face. She didn't look up when I called out, "Hey," walking closer. "Are you okay? Are you lost?" She didn't respond, didn't even flinch. I took a cautious step toward her, but before I could get too close, she stood and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I called after her, but it was like she hadn't heard me. That should have been my first clue to leave. By the time I got back to the RV, the sun was setting. I planned to hike out farther the next day, deeper into the wilderness, but something felt off. My GPS wasn't working. It kept flickering and losing signal. The RV's battery, which I had charged fully before leaving, was suddenly low, and the overhead lights flickered like they were protesting. I convinced myself it was just bad luck. "Gremlins in the system," I muttered, trying to brush off the creeping unease. The night was unnervingly quiet. I read for a while, but my focus kept drifting back to the forest, to Bill's warning. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to a sound, a low, resonant hum, like the wind was playing a deep, hollow tune through the trees. I sat up, heart pounding. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was inside the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and searched every corner, but there was nothing there. No wind, no animals, just me. But when I turned back to my bed, I froze. On the pillow was a twig about 4 inches long, perfectly straight and smooth. It hadn't been there before. My door had been locked. The next morning, I tried to shake it off as a bad dream. I packed my day bag and set out to explore the area, following one of the marked trails. The crisp air and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots were calming, at least for a while. But as I hiked, I started to notice things that didn't make sense. The trail seemed to loop back on itself in ways that defied the map. Landmarks I'd passed earlier, like a fallen tree or a cluster of boulders, reappeared in places they shouldn't have been. Around midday, I found a spiral of stones on the ground, so precise it could have been carved. Nearby, another spiral made of twigs. I knelt to take a photo, but the lens on my camera fogged up despite the dry air. Just nature being weird, I whispered to myself, but I didn't believe it. The mimicry started that afternoon. I heard my name clear as day from somewhere ahead. "Sarah, help!" I froze. It was my voice, and it sounded terrified. I scanned the forest, but saw no one. My rational mind told me it was an echo, some trick of acoustics, but I couldn't shake the dread that someone or something was watching me. I turned back toward camp, quickening my pace. The forest seemed darker now, the trees leaning in closer. I felt the weight of the silence pressing against my ears. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Sarah. In my panic, I tripped over a root and slid down a steep embankment into a ravine. At the bottom, I landed hard on my side. wincing at the sharp pain in my ribs. My flashlight had gone out, but enough daylight filtered through the trees to see where I was. The ravine was filled with more spirals, some made of bones. At the center was an old mirror, its frame blackened as if burned. My reflection stared back at me, distorted and grinning in a way that I wasn't leaving. I whispered. "Leave me alone." The grin in the mirror widened. My reflection raised a hand and pointed behind me. I turned slowly, and there it was, a shadowy figure, tall and angular with hollow pits for eyes. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. The air around it seemed to bend, pulling me closer. I scrambled backward, hitting the mirror. The reflection still wasn't mine. It was laughing silently, mockingly. The figure took a step forward, then another. My chest felt like it was being crushed. "You're not real," I said, though I didn't believe it. I grabbed a stone and hurled it at the mirror. The mirror shattered, and the figure vanished, but the spirals remained, and the oppressive silence pressed in harder than ever. I climbed out of the ravine, scraping my hands and knees on the rocks, and ran as fast as I could toward the RV. When I finally reached it, the battery was dead. The lights wouldn't turn on. The engine wouldn't start. I locked the door and sat in the driver's seat, clutching my knees, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally rose, everything seemed normal. The RV started on the first try. My GPS worked again. I drove away without looking back, the forest retreating in my rearview mirror. But that night, when I went to unpack my bag, I found something I couldn't explain. My notebook was gone, replaced by a single page from it, written in my handwriting. It read, "You were never alone." I haven't gone camping since. The wilderness still calls to me sometimes, but now I know it's not the solitude I seek. It's something else entirely. It was the second night of my trip, deep in the heart of nowhere, Texas. The kind of quiet that seems unnatural, so thick it swallows up sound, making even the wind feel like it's holding its breath. I'd been out there for a couple of days, parked on a little secluded spot I found through a camping app. Just me, my RV, and the vast, empty sky. No people, no noise, just the occasional rustle of wind through the sparse trees and the far-off chirping of crickets. Exactly what I needed to get away from everything. I thought I had no neighbors. This place was remote, miles from the nearest road, with a dirt track barely wide enough for a single car leading me to it. The land was flat and desolate, just dirt and dry brush stretching in every direction. A few scraggly trees bent under the wind, and the occasional cactus or rock stuck out from the ground like forgotten relics. It was isolation in the best way possible. Peaceful, remote, the kind of place I could disappear into. After dinner, I cleaned up and settled outside with a beer in hand, watching the sunset behind the horizon. The sky went from brilliant orange to deep purples and blues. I let the cool air fill my lungs, trying to soak in the stillness, the kind of quiet you only get when there's no one around. I was enjoying it. But then I noticed it. Out of nowhere, a van appeared. It was a plain white van, parked about 100 yards away, partially hidden behind some overgrown brush and tall patches of grass. At first, I didn't think much of it. A camper, right? Maybe someone else had found this little patch of wilderness and decided to set up a bit off the trail, but something didn't sit right. I hadn't heard the van approach, not a single sound. And the road was so isolated that it was impossible for anyone to sneak up without making noise. Yet there it was. It felt like it had been there for hours, waiting. I squinted into the fading light, trying to make out the details. The van was parked at an odd angle, like the driver was deliberately trying to stay hidden out of view. I told myself it was nothing. People come out here all the time, but a tightness in my chest told me otherwise. I kept watching, unable to shake the uneasy feeling crawling over me. Maybe it was just me overthinking. Still, the van didn't move. It stayed there, parked in the growing darkness, like it was watching me. The sun finally sank, leaving a blanket of stars overhead. I finished my beer, trying to relax, but the tension wouldn't go away. Every few minutes I'd glance at the van, but it stayed perfectly still. Almost too still. Something felt off. By midnight I was ready to turn in, but just as I was about to go inside I saw movement by the van. A figure. Someone was walking around it, moving slowly, deliberately. It wasn't an animal, this was a person. My heart skipped a beat. I ducked behind the RV's window and tried to peer out through a crack in the blinds, my pulse hammering in my chest. The figure moved cautiously, like they didn't want to be seen. And then they stopped, standing perfectly still. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a person moving around, and it didn't feel right. I stayed frozen, watching. The figure didn't do anything normal, no casual walking, no stretching. It was as though they were waiting for something, or someone. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid. Maybe they were just out for a late-night walk, but my gut was telling me something was off. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. Eventually, the figure disappeared, and the night returned to silence. The van remained where it was, unmoving. I tried to push the thoughts from my mind and crawled into bed, locking the door behind me. But even with my eyes closed, I couldn't shake the image of that figure. My mind kept replaying the moment, and I couldn't settle. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, measured. I froze. It wasn't an animal, it was human, deliberate, and it was moving outside my RV, right up close. The footsteps stopped, my heart pounded in my chest. Someone was out there. Someone was here. And then it came, a soft knock, a slow, deliberate knock, 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 on the side of the RV. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. My skin went cold. My heart stopped for a beat. Who would knock on my door out here? There was no one else for miles. I stayed absolutely still, barely breathing, praying whoever was out there wouldn't hear my heartbeat. But then the handle rattled. Not just a gentle rattle. This was hard, aggressive. Someone was trying to force their way in. My blood went cold. The handle rattled again, more violently this time. They weren't just testing the lock anymore. Whoever was out there was determined to get inside. They were yanking at the door like it was the only thing that mattered. Then came the banging. It was so loud it rattled the whole RV. Each strike felt like it was shaking the foundation. The door itself was groaning in protest, as if it might give way at any moment. Something hit the side of the RV, hard. A rock? A metal object? It crashed against the RV with force. It made me jump. They were throwing things now. They weren't just trying to get in, they were trying to break me, break the RV. I gripped the blanket with white knuckles, my mind spiraling into panic. What the hell was happening? Who were these people? And then the door handle rattled again, this time with a twist. I could hear them pulling on it, desperately trying to get inside. The banging didn't stop. It only grew louder. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to act. I crawled toward the driver's seat, my legs trembling so badly I nearly collapsed. My fingers fumbled for the keys, the flashlight, anything. I started the engine. The RV sputtered to life with a loud rumble. The sound felt like a gunshot in the stillness of the night. But it didn't matter anymore. I wasn't sticking around to find out what they were planning. I threw it in gear and floored the gas pedal, jerking the RV forward. The tires screeched against the dirt. The RV bounced over the uneven path, swerving slightly as I tried to gain control, the engine roaring as I pushed it faster than I should have. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights coming up behind me, but there was nothing. Still, I didn't feel safe. My hands were trembling so badly I almost lost grip of the wheel. It wasn't until I finally reached the main highway, miles away from that damn camping spot, that I slowed down. I tried to steady my breathing, but my pulse was still racing. My knuckles were white from gripping the wheel so hard. I didn't stop until I pulled into a gas station a couple of hours later. Even then, I didn't feel safe. I kept looking over my shoulder, checking the mirrors every few seconds. I could still hear the sound of that knocking on my door, that feeling of someone just waiting for me to slip up. I called 911. I told them what happened, gave them the details of the van, the people I saw, the banging and the knocks on my door. But when they checked the area, they couldn't find anything. Those people were long gone. No trace, no sign of anyone at the campsite. I don't know who those people were or what they wanted, but I do know one thing. I escaped something worse. My name is Bobby Stevens, and this happened to me back in 1995 in Lander, Wyoming, while I worked as a deputy in our small county sheriff's department. Thinking I knew every face in town and every secret behind each crooked fence, I was 33 then, with a wife who teased me about my thinning hair and a baby girl who giggled at my every funny face. I'd grown up just west of here, never straying far, and I spent my days the same as most local cops, breaking up the occasional bar fight, sorting out neighborly disputes about boundary lines, and swapping jokes with the old-timers outside the station. That was before I learned that even a quiet corner of Wyoming could hide horrors far worse than any tall tale I'd heard at the barber shop. It began on a Wednesday afternoon in late October. I remember because the cottonwoods along the Popo Agie River had turned a dull gold, and the crisp air carried the smell of wood smoke and dry leaves. I had been sitting in my cruiser by the old lumber yard, scribbling down notes about a stolen chainsaw, small stuff, when the call crackled over the radio. Dispatch said there was a body found near the abandoned shed off Highway 287, a place nobody visited unless they were lost or had a reason to hide. I drove out there with my partner, Dan O'Reilly, who was older and quieter and preferred chewing sunflower seeds to small talk. He and I stepped over a makeshift wire fence and came upon a scene that felt wrong even before we got close. I saw a man's boots sticking out from behind an overturned cart. My stomach knotted. We circled around, and there he was, some poor soul with a gash across his neck, eyes half open like he'd been stunned by his own final moment. I didn't recognize him. He could have been a traveler who wandered off the main highway. Dan crouched, his voice low. "You see any footprints?" I shook my head and tried to swallow, though my throat felt dry as dust. The ground was hard and the wind scattered leaves everywhere, making it tough to read anything. I felt uneasy. In a town like ours, murder wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this. We radioed in, waiting for our sheriff and the coroner. As we stood there, I found myself rubbing my arms even though I wasn't cold. Something about the emptiness of that shed and the silence made my ears ring. I remember muttering to Dan, "What kind of person does something like this out here?" He didn't answer, just spat another seed husk onto the dirt. By the next morning, we identified the victim as a traveling salesman from Minnesota. Nothing special about him, except he picked the wrong spot to stretch his legs. The autopsy told us he'd been attacked from behind with a blade, something long and sharp. That only added to the tension settling into my shoulders. Later that day, the sheriff assigned Dan and me to canvass some nearby properties. Who might have seen something unusual? Which local had noticed a stranger lurking about? I started with the big ranch east of town, a spread owned by Henry Walters. Henry was a tall guy in his 40s, with a square jaw and a habit of standing too close when he talked. He never bothered anyone that I knew of, but he had a strange, distant stare and a laugh that didn't quite match his eyes. I drove up his gravel driveway around noon. He stood outside, arms crossed, wearing a faded flannel shirt and jeans. A few scrawny chickens pecked at the ground near his porch. I asked him, "Henry, you see anybody strange on Highway 287 yesterday? Any trucks pulled over? Folks wandering around?" He shook his head slowly, his eyes flicking past me. "No, Deputy. Been quiet. Just me and these chickens. I heard a truck rumble by late last night, but didn't think much of it." His tone was even. Maybe too even. Still, nothing I could pin down. I thanked him, feeling slightly uneasy for reasons I couldn't explain. As I walked away, Henry's voice came soft. "Awful thing, that murder." I turned to face him. He nodded as if tasting the words, then walked inside without another word. Back in town, the sheriff's office hummed with an uncommon seriousness. People whispered. The town's gas station attendant mentioned someone buying a long hunting knife last week, but he couldn't recall the face. An old neighbor said they saw a figure near that abandoned shed a few nights before. I combed through these scraps, trying to form a pattern. All I got was a feeling of being watched, a tension that slithered under my skin. As the sunsets came earlier and the night seemed darker, by Friday we had another problem. A young ranch hand, a quiet kid named Miguel, hadn't shown up to work at a friend's place. His truck was found a mile off the road, door open, keys on the seat. Dan and I searched a few brushy ravines nearby. When I found Miguel, it was like my chest hollowed out. He lay crumpled behind a fallen cottonwood, his shirt stained, his face frozen in shock. He was just a kid trying to make a living. I had to close my eyes to steady myself. 2 bodies now, both stabbed. The patterns looked too similar to be chance. That evening I got home late, my wife hovering at the kitchen table. She asked, "Is everything okay, Harry?" I tried to smile, but I could feel the tension in my jaw. "Yeah, just busy. Some rough stuff at work." My daughter babbled from her high chair, and I forced myself to laugh and kiss her forehead. I wanted to believe this would all resolve quickly, but something told me we weren't anywhere near done. The next morning, as Dan and I reviewed our notes at the station, a call came in from a rancher named Carl. He said he'd found footprints around his hay barn the night before, heard someone breathing heavily in the dark. He was too scared to go out unarmed. Carl's place was near Henry Walters' property. Dan and I exchanged a glance, and I felt the hair on my arms rise. We decided to check it out after lunch. On the drive over, I gripped the steering wheel tight, trying to ignore the dryness in my mouth. We parked near Carl's barn, walked the perimeter. No one there, just some scuffed dirt that might have been footprints. Then I spotted something behind the barn door. A piece of torn fabric stuck on a nail, red and green plaid. It triggered my memory. Henry Walters wore flannel shirts like that. I said nothing for the moment. I wanted to be sure before accusing a local rancher of murder. A few hours later, Dan and I approached Henry's property again, this time without calling ahead. The afternoon light was fading. A wind rattled the old fences. We walked along the side of his main barn, a big old structure with peeling paint. Through a gap in the boards, I glimpsed something on the dirt floor inside. I leaned closer, squinting. Inside, I saw a shape slumped in the corner. I motioned silently to Dan. We forced the barn door open. The smell hit first, coppery and foul. I stepped forward and realized it was a woman. Her clothes were torn and bloody, no signs of life. That made 3 people. I clenched my fists, anger and fear mixing inside me. As we backed out, I heard a scrape of boots behind us. Henry stood in the doorway, a long hunting knife in his hand. He didn't say a word, just twitched his head slightly, as if irritated we'd found his secret. Dan reached for his weapon. Henry bolted. Around the corner of the barn, with shocking speed, we gave chase into the half-light. Stumbling over old equipment and piles of timber, he led us behind an old grain silo, and as I rounded the corner, he tackled me, sending me hard against the silo's metal wall. I felt the shock of pain in my ribs. He slashed wildly with his knife, catching my left arm before I managed to shove him off. I yelled, "Dan!" My voice cracked as I tried to keep distance from that blade. Dan appeared, panting, pistol drawn. "Henry, drop it." Henry sneered and rushed at Dan. Dan fired a single shot. Henry stumbled, grabbing at his side. For a moment I thought he'd fall. Instead, he hurled the knife at Dan, missing by inches, and lunged forward. Dan fired again. Henry collapsed onto a patch of dry weeds, his body curling inward like a question mark. I stood, shaking, pressing my hand to the cut on my arm. Dan lowered his pistol, breathing heavily. After a few seconds, I stepped closer. Henry's eyes fluttered. He managed to whisper, I could barely hear, something like, "Should have stayed out of it, Ben." He went still. I stared down at him, feeling no triumph, just a hollow sadness and relief that this was finally over. We radioed for backup, speaking in clipped tones. The dispatcher's voice sounded thin and distant. Moments later, we found a second door inside the barn, leading to a cramped workshop area. There, laid out on a bench, were more knives, ropes, and what looked like personal items taken from his victims. The smell in that enclosed space was so thick I had to stand outside. After a minute, I leaned my head against the barn's wooden wall, closed my eyes, and felt sweat on my forehead despite the cool evening air. By the time help arrived, Dan and I had checked the entire property. We found no other victims, thank God, but plenty of evidence that Henry Walters was responsible for these killings. People who knew him might never understand why. Maybe it was a hidden darkness he carried quietly for years. Maybe he just snapped. That's not a question I could answer. Afterward, I sat on the tailgate of my cruiser, a bandage taped to my arm, while Dan sipped coffee from a thermos. The sheriff put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Good work." I nodded, not sure what to say. I watched the headlights of the coroner's van as it bounced along the gravel driveway, taking away the bodies. Across the fields, darkness settled in with an eerie calm. I tried to picture tomorrow's sunrise, tried to imagine how this would all sink in, for the town, for my wife and daughter. I had done what I swore to do, protect the people here, but I felt no comfort. I just felt tired, and a bit older than I had that morning. In the days that followed, there were questions and rumors. Folks asked if we had any warning signs, if we could have stopped it sooner. Newspapers from bigger towns called for interviews, and the sheriff handled most of that. Me? I kept my head down, stuck to writing reports and testifying in hearings, and tried to move forward. Months later, when I passed that old barn on patrol, I could still smell the dust and fear in my memory. I never forgot those nights. And I never stopped wondering what triggers a man like Henry Walters to kill. But I knew, at least, that we'd closed the door on something terrible, something that never belonged in a place so quiet and unassuming as Lander, Wyoming. My name is Jason Shaw, and back in 1997 I was driving through the desolate highways of Montana, somewhere near Shelby. I was 32 then, making a living hauling freight in my old beat-up truck, and I thought nothing could surprise me after a decade of strange nights on the road. Turned out I was dead wrong. That night, the sky felt heavier than usual, like it was pressing down on the earth. I had just finished delivering a load to a warehouse in Great Falls and decided to take the scenic route back to the interstate. Scenic was a loose term. It was miles of flat nothingness, dotted with the occasional grain silo. The first odd thing happened around 10 p.m. My CB radio, which had been silent most of the night, crackled to life with static, followed by a faint, metallic voice. It wasn't English or anything I'd ever heard before. The sound made my hair stand on end, but I figured it was interference. CBs pick up weird signals sometimes, especially in remote places. I turned it off and kept driving. A few minutes later, I saw a light ahead. It wasn't headlights or the kind of glow you'd expect from a farmhouse. It was bluish-white and pulsated in a way that felt alive. At first, I thought it was a low-flying plane, or maybe some government drone. But as I got closer, the light grew brighter and my truck's engine began to sputter. Then it died altogether. Cursing, I coasted to a stop on the shoulder. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, the chill of the prairie night hitting me like a slap. The light hung about 100 yards away, hovering just above the ground. I should have gotten back in the truck and locked the doors, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked toward it. The air was electric, humming like a live wire, and my flashlight flickered before dying completely. When I got within 50 feet, the light dimmed, revealing a craft, sleek, metallic, and completely alien in design. It was shaped like an elongated teardrop with no seams or visible doors. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. That's when I noticed the figures. They emerged from the underside of the craft, their movements smooth and unnatural. There were 3 of them, each about 7 feet tall, with slender, elongated limbs and translucent skin that seemed to ripple like water. Their heads were bulbous, but not in the cartoonish way you'd see in movies. It was more functional, like every inch of them was designed for a purpose. They had no discernible faces, just smooth surfaces where features should have been. One of them held a small device, about the size of a smartphone but glowing faintly. A beam shot out from it, enveloping me in a column of light. I couldn't move. My muscles locked up and my breath hitched as the figures approached. A voice filled my head, calm and mechanical. "You are suitable for examination." I wanted to scream, to bolt back to the truck, but my body betrayed me. The light lifted me off the ground, weightless and helpless, and pulled me toward the craft. Inside, the air felt thick, almost liquid. The walls were smooth and featureless, except for faint glowing lines that pulsed rhythmically. They placed me on a table that seemed to mold itself to my shape. One of the beings hovered over me, its translucent body refracting the light like a prism. A second figure brought out what I can only describe as instruments, sleek metallic rods and discs that floated in the air as if controlled by invisible hands. The voice spoke again, this time from a device on the wall. "You are part of a random selection process. Your biology will aid in the understanding of your species' resilience." Resilience. That didn't sound comforting. They started their examination, which was a polite way of saying torture. The rods emitted pulses of energy that felt like needles burrowing into my skin. The discs hovered above me, scanning or extracting something. I couldn't tell. My brain swam with questions. Why me? Why here? Were they doing this to others? And then I heard screaming. It wasn't mine. It came from another chamber, a deep, guttural wail that made my stomach churn. They weren't just studying. They were experimenting. My mind raced, trying to piece together an escape plan, but I was still immobilized. One of the beings seemed to sense my panic. Its head tilted, and for a brief moment I felt something. Sympathy? Doubt? Whatever it was, it didn't last. The procedure continued. Suddenly there was a commotion. The craft jolted, and alarms, if you could call them that, blared in a series of high-pitched tones. The beings exchanged rapid, unintelligible clicks and whistles. One of them approached a panel on the wall, its elongated fingers manipulating glowing symbols. The lights flickered. The table released me. My body, heavy and aching, fell to the floor. The beings were distracted, their focus on whatever was causing the disturbance. Seizing the moment, I crawled toward the opening I'd been brought through. The craft shook again, and then I saw it, a figure in the distance. Human-shaped, staggering as if injured. Another captive. I couldn't see their face, but they were dragging themselves toward the edge of the field. The beings hadn't noticed yet. Summoning every ounce of strength, I stumbled out of the craft. The air outside was sharp and cold, a stark contrast to the suffocating interior. The light from the craft dimmed, and I saw the source of the disturbance. Another human, armed with a rifle, firing shots into the air. The sound was deafening, cutting through the hum of the craft. The beings hesitated, their movements jerky and uncertain. One of them approached the armed man, but he fired directly at it. The shot didn't kill the creature, but it recoiled, its translucent skin rippling violently. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran. The other captive, a woman, covered in bruises and blood, collapsed as I reached her. I grabbed her arm, dragging her toward the truck. Behind us, the armed man screamed, a wet, gurgling sound that ended abruptly. I didn't look back. Reaching the truck, I threw the woman into the passenger seat and jumped behind the wheel. The engine sputtered to life on the third try, and I floored it. The craft loomed in the rearview mirror, its light growing dimmer as we sped away. Neither of us spoke until we reached a gas station an hour later. The attendant stared at us like we were ghosts, which, honestly, wasn't far from the truth. The woman, her name was Lisa, told me she'd been taken from her home in Alberta weeks ago. She didn't know how many others there were, or why they'd been chosen. We reported it to the authorities, but they wrote us off as crackpots. The only thing they couldn't explain was the body we found the next morning, miles from where it all started. The armed man, or what was left of him. His torso was shredded, the flesh cauterized in a way no weapon could achieve. Lisa and I parted ways after that. I tried to go back to my life, but nothing felt normal anymore. The prairie nights, once so empty and serene, now felt suffocating. I left Montana for good a few months later. As for the beings, I never saw them again. But sometimes, when the sky is just right, I catch a flicker of bluish-white light and wonder, how many others have they taken, and how many never made it back? I noticed a shadow moving outside my RV as I was preparing dinner. At first I thought it was nothing, just the flicker of a tree swaying in the wind or maybe an animal passing through, but then it came back, a shape. It was strange how steady it seemed, moving slowly, deliberately. I had parked my RV at a small, secluded campground near Shasta Lake, California. It was a quiet place, tucked away in the trees, far from the hustle of city life. The place felt peaceful when I arrived earlier that day. It was off-season, so the campground was nearly empty, which was fine by me. I liked the solitude. I was chopping vegetables for a stew when I first saw the shadow. My hands froze for a second, the knife mid-air. I brushed it off. Probably just a deer, I thought. I kept my eyes on the stove, trying to stay focused. But there it was again, closer this time. The figure wasn't moving like a normal person would, more like it was carefully pacing just outside the window. I could see the silhouette through the thin curtains. I quickly stepped away from the counter, suddenly feeling uneasy. I don't know why, but my first instinct wasn't to call the campground office or grab my phone. It was just a feeling of dread creeping over me, something I couldn't quite explain. I grabbed my flashlight and approached the small kitchen window, trying to get a better look. I squinted into the darkness but couldn't make out any details, just a shape standing outside. It was too still, too silent. I could feel my pulse quickening. "Hello?" I called out, forcing my voice to stay calm. "Do you need something?" I had no idea who it might be. Maybe someone else staying in the campground? There was no answer, no movement. It just stood there, motionless. I took a deep breath and opened the RV door, telling myself that I was just overthinking it. But the moment the door creaked open, the figure bolted, running into the trees. My heart skipped a beat as I stepped outside, shining the flashlight in the direction they had gone. All I could see were shadows. The air felt thick, oppressive. I tried to call out, but the words caught in my throat. I stood there for what seemed like forever, listening to the distant sound of leaves crunching as the person moved deeper into the woods. But they were gone, just like that. I turned and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I glanced out the window, hoping I was just imagining things. It wasn't like me to get so paranoid, but something about that encounter had unsettled me. I kept my RV door locked, double-checked the windows, and even wedged a chair under the handle just to be safe. But still, I couldn't sleep well. The quiet of the night was suffocating, the silence too thick to ignore. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound. It was soft at first, almost like a tapping. I assumed it was rain, or maybe the wind hitting the side of the RV, but as I listened more closely, I realized the tapping was rhythmic, deliberate. It wasn't coming from the roof, but from the side of the RV. Close, as if someone was standing right outside. I felt my blood run cold. My heart started pounding in my chest. I didn't move. I just lay there, listening. The tapping continued for a few more seconds before it stopped. The silence that followed was even more disturbing. I could hear the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. I wanted to get up, to look out the window, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What if it was the same person from earlier? Then came the worst sound. Footsteps. Slow. Methodical. Walking around the RV. Pacing. Just out of sight. It was like they were circling the RV, studying it, watching. I held my breath, straining to hear. I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone was outside, and they weren't just passing through. I heard something scrape against the side of the RV. It wasn't a branch or an animal. It sounded like a knife or something sharp, the guy dragging along the metal. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Whoever it was wasn't just making noise for no reason. They were trying to get my attention. I didn't want to make any noise, but my mind raced. I thought about my options. Should I just stay quiet and hope they'd go away? What if they were trying to break in? I was in the middle of nowhere, far from help. Then the scraping sound stopped, and I thought, maybe it was over. Maybe they left. But then, just as I was starting to breathe easier, I heard a loud crash. Glass shattering. I jumped out of bed, my heart leaping into my throat. I didn't know what to do. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy flashlight, and crept to the window. That's when I saw the figure again. Closer this time. They were standing at the back of the RV, near the window where I had left the blinds cracked. The person reached down and tried the handle. The RV door was locked, but I knew it wouldn't stop them for long. I could hear them fumbling with the lock, trying to force it open. I could feel panic rising in my chest. I knew I had to do something. My eyes flicked to the corner of the room where I had installed a loud alarm. It was just a precaution. But I never thought I'd need to use it. I grabbed the remote, pressed the panic button, and held my breath. The sound that erupted from the alarm was deafening, a shrill, ear-piercing noise that filled the entire RV. For a second, everything stopped. I heard the person curse. Then, footsteps. Running, they bolted into the woods. I didn't dare move. I stayed still, listening to the silence that followed. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just kept the alarm remote in my hand, waiting for any sign that they'd return. In the morning, I packed up and left as quickly as I could. I didn't report it to the police. I wouldn't even know how to describe them. All I knew was that I wasn't sticking around to find out. To this day, I don't camp alone anymore. Every time I think about that night, I feel a chill. I never found out who that person was, or what they wanted, but I don't plan on ever finding out. My name is Ronald Lopez, and I was 33 years old when I barely made it out of Blackwater River State Park alive. I still don't know how to explain what happened out there, at least not in a way that people would believe. The authorities wrote it off as a drug operation gone wrong, a tragic accident, a simple case of wrong place, wrong time. But I know better. It wasn't an accident. It was a hunt, and we were the prey. It started with a road trip, just 4 of us in an old RV looking for adventure. My girlfriend Harper had read about a hidden waterfall deep in Blackwater's woods. She wanted to film it for her travel vlog, a series she called Lost Florida. Her best friend, Sarah, tagged along. And then there was Jake, my childhood buddy, a guy I hadn't seen in years. He was the one who found the special campsite, promising it was off-grid, untouched, a place few had ever seen. I should have questioned that. I should have questioned a lot of things. The first sign something was wrong came at a gas station just outside the park. Some old man, wiry, sunburned, skin stretched too tight over his bones, watched us fill up. When I went inside to pay, he followed, stepping up close behind me in line. "Ain't nothing out there but hungry things," he murmured. "You'll best stick to the marked roads." I turned to get a better look at him, but he was already shuffling toward the door. I told myself he was just another backwoods local, one of those people who hated outsiders. Florida was full of them. I didn't say anything to Harper or Sarah, but Bo, my old Labrador, had his ears pinned back the second we pulled into the trees. That dog never barked unless there was real danger. But that night, sitting by the fire outside the RV, he wouldn't stop growling at the woods. Then the generator died. Jake cursed, claiming it was a fuse, that he'd fix it in the morning. But I saw him pocket something small and metallic when he thought I wasn't looking. He had a satellite phone. Why the hell would he need a satellite phone? I didn't get to ask, because that's when Sarah found the bones. At first, I thought they were deer remains. Maybe a boar. But then I saw them up close, yellowed with age, small finger bones tangled in the dirt like someone had tried to claw their way out of the ground. There were teeth marks on them. Human teeth. Harper wanted to leave. I agreed, but Jake? Jesus, you guys are paranoid, he laughed. There's a town like 20 minutes from here. If people were getting eaten out here, don't you think someone would have noticed? Harper wasn't convinced, but she wanted that waterfall. Just a little longer, she said. Just one more day. I wish I'd forced her to go. Later that night, I woke to something moving outside. It wasn't footsteps. It was heavier, dragging like someone pulling a body through the leaves. Then a whistle, high and piercing, sharp enough to make Bo's hackles rise. It came from deep in the trees. But then, too fast, it was right outside the RV. I grabbed the rifle I kept under the bed, but when I yanked the curtain aside, nothing was there. I should have woken everyone. I should have packed up right then. Instead, I told myself it was just an animal. By morning, Harper was gone. We found her camera first, smashed on the ground, covered in blood. Then Sarah screamed. A trail of drag marks led from our campsite into the woods. I grabbed my rifle. Jake didn't grab anything, because he already knew. "We have to find her," I said. "We won't," Jake muttered. His face was pale. Guilty. "If they took her, she's already dead." "Who the hell is they?" Sarah snapped. Then the whistle came again, and the woods erupted. Figures lunged from the brush, skinny, fast, masked in animal skulls. One grabbed Sarah, yanking her by the hair. Another slammed into me, knocking my rifle away. I heard Bo yelp in pain, then silence, and then something cracked against my skull. Darkness. I woke up in a dirt cellar. The air was thick with the smell of rot and blood. I tried to move. My arms were tied, my legs bound. Across from me, Sarah was slumped against the wall. She was barely conscious. Her right hand was gone. I fought the nausea clawing up my throat. They had cut off her hand. She was losing too much blood. If I didn't get us out, she was dead. Then the door creaked open. An old man stepped in. P. Merritt. That's what he called himself. His eyes were milky. His smile, too wide. "We don't waste nothing out here," he said, holding Sarah's severed hand up like a prize. "She's still got more to give, though. Maybe a leg next." I lunged at him, rage drowning out the pain in my skull, but the rope held tight. P. Merritt just laughed. "Patience, boy," he murmured. "You'll get your turn." Then Jake walked in, untied, unharmed. "I'm sorry, man," he muttered. "I didn't have a choice. I wanted to kill him right there with my bare hands, but I didn't have that option." Jake looked at me, real regret in his eyes, but not enough regret to stop him from handing over Harper. "They get her, and I go free," he said, voice shaking. "That was the deal." And just like that, they dragged Harper out of sight. I don't remember much after that. Just rage. A blinding, burning rage that fueled me past the pain. I don't know how, but I snapped my thumb out of its socket, slipped the rope, and tore through the nearest guard. I grabbed his knife. I grabbed Sarah. I hunted Harper down. She was tied to a table, screaming as one of them hovered over her with a meat saw. I shot him in the back of the head. Then all hell broke loose. Sarah couldn't run, so I threw her over my shoulder. Harper grabbed a shotgun from the wall, blew another cultist apart, and we ran. The others chased us, howling, crawling on all fours like animals. And Jake. We found him outside, blocking our path. "I didn't have a choice," he whispered. I put a bullet in his gut and left him to die. We stole a truck from their farm and plowed through the trees. They were still running after us when we hit the highway. When I looked back, they were gone. The police found nothing, no bodies, no cellar. No sign of P. Merritt or his family. Sarah died in the hospital. Harper stopped speaking. And me, I know the truth. They're still out there, and they're still hungry. The road into Zaleski State Forest twisted like a black ribbon through the trees, the late autumn chill seeping through the cracks of my old RV. It was exactly the kind of place I loved, remote, rugged, and steeped in just enough folklore to make things interesting. I'd read about Zaleski on a cryptid forum, where whispers of a forest demon had been growing louder in recent years. Disappearances, claw marks, voices mimicking loved ones. Most people dismissed it as tall tales. I wasn't most people. My name's Marcus, and for the last decade, chasing cryptids has been my passion. Not that I believed in all of them. Bigfoot, the Jersey Devil, Mothman. Maybe they were real, maybe not. But there's something intoxicating about the hunt, the chance to glimpse the unknown. The general store near the park entrance was exactly what I expected. Dusty shelves, flickering neon lights, and a cashier who looked like he'd seen too much. As I grabbed a pack of jerky and a map, an older man leaned against the counter, his hunter orange vest frayed at the edges. "You camping out here alone?" he asked, his voice gravely. "Yep," I replied, folding the map. The man snorted. "You ever hear about the thing that lives out here?" I raised an eyebrow. "The Wendigo?" His expression darkened. "Call it what you want, but it ain't natural. It don't just kill, it hunts, mimics, likes to play with its food. You hear it call your name, you run." I smiled politely and paid for my things. I'd heard plenty of stories like his before, but there was something about his tone, dead serious, almost pleading, that sent a shiver down my spine. The campsite was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by towering trees, miles from the nearest road. No phone service, no neighbors. Just the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the last person on Earth. I set up my gear, trail cameras, a recorder, my hunting knife strapped to my belt. By the time I started a small fire, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. The first night passed uneventfully. A barred owl hooted somewhere in the distance, and the occasional crackle of the fire kept me company. I slept soundly, dreaming of nothing in particular. It was the second night when things got strange. I woke to a sound I couldn't place. At first I thought it was the wind, but no, it was heavier, more deliberate. Crunch, crunch, footsteps. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees. Nothing moved, but the forest felt alive, like it was holding its breath. I told myself it was just a deer, or maybe a raccoon nosing around my campsite. Then came the growl, low, guttural, and close, too close. My stomach tightened as I turned the flashlight toward the sound. The beam caught something, a flash of yellow eyes, too high off the ground to belong to any animal I'd ever seen. The light flickered, and when it steadied, the eyes were gone. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The next day, I followed the tracks I found near my camp. They were deep, clawed, and much larger than any predator native to Ohio. They led deeper into the forest, winding past twisted trees and patches of scorched earth. That's when I found the clearing. The trees here were blackened and split as though struck by lightning. Bones, animal and otherwise, were scattered across the ground, some gnawed clean, others broken as if by massive jaws. A strange symbol was carved into a nearby tree, jagged and crude like a warning. I pulled out my camera, snapping photos and recording every detail. Adrenaline buzzed through me. This was it. The kind of evidence that could make my name in the cryptid community. But as the sun dipped lower, the forest seemed to change. The air grew colder, the shadows longer. A feeling of dread settled over me, like I was being watched. Back at camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The growling started again as soon as the fire died down, circling the campsite. I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. The growling stopped. For a moment the forest was silent. Then I heard it. Marcus. The voice was raspy, unnatural, but unmistakably mine. Marcus! It called again, drawing the word out like a taunt. I grabbed my hunting knife, backing toward the RV. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the clearing. My heart pounded as I scanned the darkness, my flashlight cutting through the trees. That's when I saw it. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in shadow. It was gaunt and skeletal, its grey skin stretched tight over its bones. Antlers jutted from its head, twisted and jagged, and its glowing yellow eyes burned like embers. It moved with an unnatural grace, stepping into the light as if daring me to react. Its mouth opened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. Marcus, it whispered, its voice echoing in my head. I ran. I didn't think, didn't plan, just sprinted for the RV and slammed the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I locked every window and grabbed the flare gun from the glove compartment. The growling returned, louder now, accompanied by the sound of claws scraping against metal. The RV rocked as the creature slammed into the side, leaving deep gouges in the aluminum. I fired a flare through the window, the bright light illuminating the clearing. The creature recoiled with an unearthly scream, its antlers catching fire as it stumbled back into the trees. For a moment, everything was still. Then the whispers began again, surrounding the RV, each voice more distorted than the last. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn finally broke, the forest seemed almost peaceful, as if nothing had happened. The scratches on the RV and the torn-up ground around the clearing were the only signs it wasn't a nightmare. I didn't stick around to find out more. By the time the sun was fully up, I was driving out of Zaleski as fast as the RV could manage. At a ranger station near the edge of the forest, I tried to explain what I'd seen. The rangers listened politely, but dismissed it as a bear encounter. Stress can play tricks on your mind, one of them said, but I knew better. When I got home, I reviewed the footage from my camera. Most of it was corrupted, static-filled and distorted, but one frame was clear. The creature's face, its glowing eyes staring directly into the lens. I haven't gone camping since. I didn't come to the forest to be haunted. I came to forget. The sun was setting when I parked the RV in a small clearing, far enough from the main campground that I wouldn't hear the chatter of families or see the glow of campfires. I needed quiet, a space to untangle my thoughts. The past month at work had been a train wreck. Another code blue, another patient I couldn't save. Their faces blurred together now, a collage of failure etched into my memory. The forest seemed like balm, towering trees, the soft murmur of the Clear Fork River somewhere in the distance. I took a deep breath, letting the clean air fill my lungs. Maybe here I could finally breathe again. After setting up camp, I decided to explore before it got too dark. A trailhead nearby led to Moonville Tunnel, an old railway passage I'd read about online, supposedly haunted, but I didn't buy into that nonsense. Still, it would make for a good story to tell later. The trail was quiet, except for the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. When I reached the tunnel, the sight was surreal. A gaping black mouth surrounded by moss-covered stone. Its archway was covered in graffiti. The air was cooler here, a sudden drop in temperature that raised goosebumps on my skin. I stepped inside, pulling out my phone to snap a picture. That's when I heard it, a faint melodic hum like someone singing a hymn. I froze, the hairs on my neck standing up. Hello? I called, my voice echoing. The singing stopped. I shone my flashlight down the tunnel, the beam cutting through the gloom. At the far end, something flickered. A light, faint and yellow, like an old lantern swaying in the breeze. Is someone there? I asked. No answer. The light vanished as quickly as it appeared. I swallowed hard and backed out of the tunnel, the weight of unseen eyes pressing on my back. Night fell quickly in the forest. I cooked a quick dinner on the camp stove, trying to shake off the unease from the tunnel. It was probably just a trick of the light, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. But I was lying. Half asleep in bed that night, the knocking started. 3 soft taps, like a child at the door. My heart leapt into my throat. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, fumbling with the switch. Who's there? I called, but there was no answer. I hesitated, then crept to the door and cracked it open. A boy stood there, pale and thin, dressed in clothes that looked decades old. His eyes were sunken, and his lips trembled as he spoke. "Please don't forget us," he said. The words sent a chill down my spine. Before I could respond, the boy turned and ran into the woods, his small frame swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, I couldn't shake the image of the boy. I walked the perimeter of my campsite, searching for any sign of him. That's when I noticed the carvings on the trees, names, dozens of them etched into the bark in jagged letters. Some were accompanied by dates, others by strange symbols I didn't recognize. One name stood out, Eleanor. My name. The carving was fresh, the edges of the letters still raw and oozing sap. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I needed answers. I drove into the nearest town and found the public library. It didn't take long to find records of disappearances tied to the forest. Many of the names matched those I'd seen on the trees, people who'd vanished without a trace. Their cases were long forgotten. An older woman with a kind face, the librarian, noticed my growing pile of newspaper clippings. "You've been to Moonville Tunnel, haven't you?" she asked. I nodded. She hesitated, glancing around before leaning in close. "The forgotten ones," she whispered. "Spirits of those who disappeared in the forest. They can't move on because no one remembers them." Her words lingered as I drove back to camp that night. The footsteps began shortly after I sat by the campfire, soft and deliberate, circling the RV. I shone my flashlight into the trees, but the beam caught only shadows. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. The footsteps stopped, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. I locked the RV door and huddled inside, my heart pounding. Sleep was impossible. My dreams were vivid and horrifying, wandering the forest, lost, while voices whispered my name. When I woke, the name Eleanor was carved into the side of the RV. The boy appeared again the next evening, standing just beyond the firelight. "Why are you following me?" I demanded, gripping my flashlight tightly. "We want to be remembered," he said, his voice trembling. "Please help us." Before I could respond, shadows merged from the trees, dozens of figures, their faces gaunt and pale, their eyes hollow. They surrounded the campsite, their forms flickering like static images. I stumbled back, panic clawing at my chest. "What do you want?" I whispered. "Say our names," they whispered in unison. "Tell our stories." I returned to the tunnel, hoping to find a way to help them. The air inside was suffocating, heavy with an unnatural chill. The shadows followed me, their whispers growing louder. At the far end of the tunnel, a shape emerged, tall, inhuman, a mass of darkness that seemed to pulse and writhe. The entity spoke without words, its voice invading my mind. Leave or stay forever. I refused to run. I gathered the personal items scattered throughout the tunnel, rusted jewelry, scraps of fabric, and carried them back to the campsite. Under the starlit sky, I built a circle of candles and laid the items within. One by one, I read the names aloud from the clippings I'd found. My voice shook but remained steady. The shadows gathered around me, their forms more solid now. The boy stepped forward, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered as his body began to fade. The entity screamed, a sound that ripped through the air like thunder. It surged toward me, but the light of the candles flared bright, forcing it back. The shadows disappeared and the forest fell silent. The carvings were gone. The next morning, the bark of the trees was smooth and unmarked. I drove away, the weight of the forest lifting with each mile. But at night, when the world is quiet, I still hear the boy's voice. "Please don't forget us." My name's Kevin Scott, and I've never had much of a conventional career. Growing up in rural Indiana, I was used to hard work. My father taught me to hunt at a young age, not for sport, but because it was necessary for survival. Living off the land became second nature, which I guess is why years later I got recruited by a very quiet branch of the US government. Most people have never heard of us. Those who have might think of us as conspiracy theorists with too much time on our hands. We hunt monsters. This time, they sent me to a place called Willow's Rest in Nebraska. It's a tiny, unremarkable town surrounded by cornfields that stretch for miles. Nothing much different from my own hometown. But something was very wrong here. The locals had reported disappearances, farmers and travelers who had just gone missing, their bodies sometimes found days later, mauled beyond recognition. The local law enforcement called it wild animals, but they knew it wasn't. That's where we came in. I arrived under the cover of being an agricultural inspector. My government ID said I worked for the USDA, but my actual mission was something much darker. They partnered me with a guy named Garrett Moore, who'd been doing this longer than me, but was quieter than a snake in the grass. Garrett didn't talk much about his past, and I didn't pry. We'd been working together for a year and already had an unspoken understanding. Don't ask questions unless it'll save your life. Willow's Rest wasn't any different from dozens of other towns I'd been to for these kinds of jobs. Quiet, polite, but with an underlying tension. The people were scared, though they didn't say it outright. It was in the way they watched the sky, how they didn't walk alone at night, and how they never seemed to talk about the things they'd seen. At first, I thought this might be just another cryptid, a large predator that had slipped into human territory, maybe something along the lines of a Wendigo or a skinwalker. But something felt off. Garrett and I spent a few days setting up surveillance in the cornfields surrounding the town. The corn grew tall, taller than I'd ever seen in Indiana. It reached above my head, swaying in the wind like an endless ocean of green and gold. We kept hearing reports of something large moving through the fields, and occasionally a gutted animal carcass was found near the edges. The locals were jumpy, but no one was talking openly. Something was keeping them quiet. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we set up a base camp on the edge of one of the largest cornfields. The owner, a nervous farmer named Clyde, gave us permission, but wouldn't stay long enough to even discuss what he'd seen. "It's not natural," he muttered before speeding away in his old pickup. Garrett and I exchanged looks. We'd seen plenty of unnatural things, but whatever this was, it had gotten deep into the bones of these people. Night fell fast in those open fields. The sky was huge, stars sprinkled like salt over the black dome above us. We had rifles, tranquilizers, and an arsenal of other tools in case things got ugly. Around midnight, it started. At first, it was subtle, just a rustling in the corn that could have been the wind, but it was too deliberate. Then came the smell, a rancid, decaying stench that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Garrett nodded toward the field, and we both stood, weapons drawn, listening. The rustling grew louder, more erratic. Whatever it was big. I wasn't prepared for what came next. A shadow emerged from the corn, moving on all four paws, but not like any animal I'd ever seen. It was long and gaunt, its limbs grotesquely elongated like a spider's. The skin was grey and mottled, stretched tight over sharp bones that jutted out at odd angles. The head was canine in shape, but the mouth was wide, too wide, lined with rows of uneven teeth that reminded me of a shark. Its back arched unnaturally high, and its eyes, I didn't want to look at them, but I had no choice. They were black, empty, reflecting nothing. The thing moved with impossible speed, tearing through the cornfield toward us. Garrett fired first, a sharp crack splitting the night air. The creature veered fast enough to dodge the shot, but not entirely. It let out a sound somewhere between a scream and a roar, something primal and alien, as the bullet grazed its side. The smell of burning flesh hit my nose, silver bullets as usual. I fired next, aiming for its mass, and this time I hit it dead on. The creature staggered, but instead of dropping, it bolted back into the corn. We pursued, but it was like chasing a shadow through the fields. We lost it within minutes, but not before we stumbled across something far worse. In the clearing there were bodies, or what was left of them. The stench of decay hit us like a punch to the gut. I counted 5, maybe 6 bodies, but it was hard to tell. They were in pieces, torn apart as if something had ripped into them with savage, deliberate force. Limbs were scattered, faces barely recognizable. One poor soul had been gutted, his insides spilling out into the dirt like a grotesque feast. Garrett knelt beside the bodies, his face a stone mask. "This thing's not just killing for food," he said flatly. "It's hunting." We returned to town with what little we had, a few blood samples, a torn piece of flesh from the creature, and our grim report. Clyde didn't ask questions when we told him to leave his farm. The sheriff didn't either when we recommended a full evacuation of the area. They trusted us, or maybe they were just too scared to defy whatever had taken hold of Willow's Rest. 2 nights later, we set up our final stand in the center of the cornfield. We lured the creature with fresh livestock, bound and bleeding, at the edge of the clearing. This time we were ready. Infrared cameras, motion sensors, traps, everything we could muster. The creature came again, as we knew it would. It emerged from the darkness, slower this time, cautious, but we had the upper hand now. As it approached the bait, Garrett hit the trigger, and the trap sprang shut around it. Metal spikes impaled its legs, and it let out that awful scream again, thrashing wildly as we closed in. Up close, the creature was even more horrifying. Its skin was paper-thin, stretched tight over what looked like too many bones. It writhed and snarled as we raised our rifles, silver bullets aimed for its heart. "Let's finish this," Garrett said. We fired in unison. The bullets ripped through the creature's chest, and it collapsed in a heap of twitching limbs. For a moment it lay still, and then its body began to convulse. We stood back, rifles still trained on it, but whatever energy it had left was draining fast. Finally, it stopped moving. I stood over the corpse, breathing hard, waiting for something else to happen. Something worse. But nothing did. The thing was dead, and it wasn't coming back. The next morning, the locals came out of hiding. They didn't ask us questions. They didn't need to. Clyde packed up and left town for good, as did most of the others. Willow's Rest became a ghost town. In the weeks that followed, the fields grew wild and untamed. As for Garrett and me, we moved on to the next job, leaving the body of that thing where it lay. We never figured out what it was. Maybe we never would. All I know is that the cornfields of Willow's Rest were quiet now, too quiet, but that suited me just fine. My name is Jeffrey Walker, and this happened to me on October 15th, 1996. I had taken my old RV out to the Ozarks for a weekend camping trip. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape from my job in St. Louis. I'd always loved the solitude and the sense of disconnect from the world. My wife Karen had passed away a few years back, and these trips were my way of dealing with the grief. The weather was perfect that weekend, sunny with a slight breeze. I set up camp near a small, clear stream. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the forest was full of reds and golds. I parked the RV in a clearing and started a fire. It was just me and my dog, Rusty, an old but loyal German shepherd. That first day I hiked a few trails, fished in the stream, and relaxed by the fire. I didn't see another soul, which was just how I liked it. As night fell, the forest became alive with the sounds of crickets and distant owls. I cooked some dinner over the fire and settled in with a beer. Rusty lay by my feet, staring into the flames. Around midnight, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. It wasn't unusual to hear animals moving around at night, but this sounded different. Rusty perked up, ears pointed, and started a low rumble in his throat. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the noise, but saw nothing. I shrugged it off and went back to my beer, though I kept the flashlight within reach. The next day was more of the same, hiking and fishing. I found an old abandoned cabin deeper in the woods. It looked like it had been there for decades, windows broken, roof caved in. I poked around a bit but didn't find anything interesting. I headed back to camp as the sun started to set, planning to turn in early. That night things got stranger. Around the same time, just past midnight, Rusty started growling again. This time it was more intense. I heard the rustling again, closer. This time I grabbed my flashlight and the knife and stepped out of the RV. I shone the light into the trees, and this time I saw it clearly. A tall, gaunt figure, its eyes reflecting the light. It was humanoid but twisted, with long limbs and a hunched back. It was covered in matted fur, and its face was distorted, almost animalistic. It stared at me for a moment, then disappeared into the darkness. I was frozen with fear. Rusty was going crazy, barking and pulling at his leash. I backed up toward the RV, keeping the flashlight trained on the spot where I had seen the creature. I could hear it moving around, circling the camp. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept the fire going and sat with my back against the RV, knife in hand. Rusty stayed by my side, growling and barking whenever he heard something. I was scared out of my mind, but there was nothing I could do except wait for morning. When the sun finally came up, I decided to pack up and leave. I couldn't stay another night in those woods. I quickly loaded everything into the RV, keeping an eye on the tree line. Rusty was just as anxious to leave as I was. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature following us, but there was nothing. We made it back to St. Louis without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to put the experience behind me, but it haunted me. I did some research, looking for any stories or legends about creatures in the Ozarks, but I didn't find much. I told a few friends about what happened, but they just laughed it off, saying I probably had too much to drink. Years passed, but I never went back to the Ozarks. I sold the RV and bought a small cabin in the mountains, far from any forest. Rusty passed away a few years after the incident, and I got a new dog, but I never forgot that night. It wasn't until a few months ago that I heard something that sent chills down my spine. I was at a bar talking to an old friend who was into cryptids. I told him my story, and he listened intently. When I was done, he nodded and said, "Sounds like you ran into the Wendigo." The name struck a chord with me. I'd heard it before, a Native American legend about a creature that was once human, but had been transformed by a curse. It made sense, in a way. The creature I saw was almost human, but not quite. It was something else. Something ancient and evil. I don't know if what I saw was really a Wendigo, but it was enough to keep me out of the woods for the rest of my life. I still have nightmares sometimes, waking up in a cold sweat, hearing the rustling of leaves and the distant growl of something in the darkness. So that's my story. It's not something I like to talk about, but maybe sharing it will help me move on. If you ever find yourself in the Ozarks, be careful. There's something out there, something that's been there for a long time, waiting. My name is Brian Patel. I was 33 years old when it happened. People think journalists are fearless, but that's not true. We chase stories because we want to expose the truth. The problem is, sometimes the truth is something you were never supposed to find. This happened in Devil's Millhopper Geological State Park, Florida. I'd driven my RV out there looking for a fresh start, or at least, that's what I told myself. The truth was, my career was in shambles. A failed expose on a corrupt politician had left me blacklisted from every major news outlet. No one wanted to hire a journalist who fabricated evidence, even though I knew what I saw was real. So I ran, packed up my things and took a long drive through Florida's forests, looking for something, anything, to make sense of my life again. That's how I ended up here, parked on the edge of the massive sinkhole they called Devil's Millhopper. The locals told me not to camp too close. They spoke about strange noises, people who went missing, stories of voices calling your name in the night. I laughed it off. I didn't believe in that kind of thing. But I was a journalist without a job, and this was as good a story as any. I set up my RV, grabbed my camera, and hiked down into the sinkhole. The trail led into a deep, bowl-shaped pit surrounded by dense trees and waterfalls trickling from the limestone walls. It was beautiful in a way that made me uneasy, like something ancient was watching me. An hour in, I found something I wasn't expecting. A backpack. It was lying near the base of a tree, half covered in mud, the zipper broken. Clothes were strewn around it, along with a phone, cracked, battery dead. A woman's ID peeked out from the front pocket. Sarah Bennett, age 27. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. Had she just left it here? Gotten lost? Then I heard the scream. It came from deeper in the woods, a sharp, ragged cry that cut through the silence and stopped just as suddenly. I ran toward the sound. The trees grew thicker, and the path became harder to follow. I forced my way through, my breath loud in my ears. Then I stopped. A man stood just ahead, near the base of the sinkhole. He was tall, lean, wearing an old flannel shirt and jeans that were too clean for someone who had been hiking. His hair was slicked back, his skin pale. He smiled. "You shouldn't be here," I hesitated. "Did you hear that scream?" He tilted his head. "What scream?" I held up the ID. "This girl, she lost her bag out here. Did you see her?" The man stepped forward. "Maybe. A lot of people get lost here." Something about him put me on edge. His smile was too wide, too knowing. I backed away. "I should get back," I muttered. His grin widened. "Of course. I'll see you soon, Brian." My blood went cold. I hadn't told him my name. I turned and walked quickly back to my RV, refusing to look back. That night I locked the doors, checked the windows twice, and tried to sleep. But I couldn't. At some point I heard something outside, a soft tapping on the RV door. My heart pounded. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, peering out. No one was there. Then, in the reflection, I saw movement behind me. I spun around, but the RV was empty. The next morning, I found something scratched into the dirt just outside the door. "Let me out." I packed my things. I was leaving. As I stepped outside, I nearly ran into someone. It was the man from the woods. "Leaving so soon?" he asked. I stepped back, gripping my keys. "Yeah, something feels off here." His expression flickered, just for a second, like he was disappointed. "That's a shame. You were supposed to stay longer." I forced a laugh. "Guess I'll have to come back some other time." He stared at me. Then he grinned again. "You've been here before." My stomach clenched. "What? You don't remember?" He took a step forward. "You were here last year. Same RV, same excuses. But last time, you didn't leave." My fingers tightened around my keys. "I don't know what the hell you're talking about." "You will," he whispered. I jumped into the RV, locked the door, and started the engine. The man didn't move. He just watched me. As I drove away, I caught one last glimpse of him in the side mirror. He wasn't smiling anymore. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. That night, at a gas station an hour away, I found something in my back seat. A phone, cracked. Battery dead. Sarah Bennett's phone. I never went back to Devil's Millhopper. but sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear his voice. You've been here before. My name is Lucas Norris, and this all went down back in 1997, right outside Great Bend, Kansas. I wasn't a farmer, but I owned a chunk of land with a decrepit barn and a trailer that smelled like burnt coffee and regret. My dad's old place, which I inherited because no one else wanted it. I spent most days tinkering with old radios and small engines. It was nothing glamorous, but people needed their stuff fixed, and I liked being the guy to do it. My ex-wife used to say I had a knack for fixing everything but myself, which was probably true. The nights out here were quiet, which suited me fine, until one wasn't. I was out in the barn that evening, trying to rewire a busted ham radio that a guy from 3 counties over had brought me. Static crackled faintly through the old speakers, almost rhythmic, like something tapping against my brain. I shook it off, told myself I'd been drinking too much gas station coffee. The light over my workbench flickered, and that's when I heard the first scream. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal either. It had a pitch, a kind of warbling that seemed to twist in on itself. I froze, my hands gripping the pliers like a lifeline. A second scream followed, closer, slicing through the air like a blade through fabric. I stepped outside. The air felt heavy, like a storm about to break, but the sky was clear. My truck sat 20 yards away, and for a moment I thought about leaving. Then I saw the field. There were lights, not like car headlights or even those high beams farmers used to scare off deer. These were blue and pulsating, hovering low over the corn. It was hypnotic, almost beautiful, until I realized they were moving. They weren't stationary. They were coming toward me. Something instinctive made me bolt for the truck. My keys were in my pocket, but my fingers fumbled like they'd forgotten how to work. Before I could get the door open, the lights hit me. It wasn't just light, it was sound, like a low hum that bypassed my ears and went straight to my bones. My legs gave out and I hit the dirt hard. When I came to, I was in a circular room. The walls glowed faintly, and the floor seemed to ripple under me like liquid metal. I tried to move, but my arms and legs were strapped to a table. The straps weren't leather or nylon, but something translucent, almost alive. I tested their strength, pulling hard. They didn't budge. Human designation Lucas Norris, a voice said. It was deep, resonant, and oddly polite, like someone reading off a checklist. I craned my neck to see who or what was talking. They weren't human. Their bodies were tall and wiry, covered in a metallic sheen that shimmered like oil on water. They had no mouths, but the voice was clear as day, like it was coming from inside my skull. Their heads were oblong, with ridges where a nose might have been. Where the hell am I? My voice cracked, but I tried to sound steady. Spatial Junction 547, Sector 8. Your designation is irrelevant. Your utility will be determined. My utility? I snapped, yanking against the restraints. I'm not a damn lab rat. One of them moved closer, its body bending unnaturally, as if it had too many joints. A thin, needle-like appendage extended from its arm, glowing faintly. Your anatomy will be catalogued. Catalogue this, I barked, thrashing against the table. The needle hovered inches from my chest, and that's when I felt it, a sharp, burning pain in my ribs. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought they had pumped me full of something. But then I heard it, a woman screaming. It wasn't me, it wasn't my voice, it was someone else. The sound was raw, agonized, echoing through the room. One of the creatures tilted its head as if annoyed. Interference, it said. The walls shimmered, and a second later a body slammed against them, a human body. A woman, mid-30s, dressed in what looked like a mechanic's uniform. She was bleeding from her temple, her eyes wide with terror. "Help me," she gasped, her voice hoarse. Before I could respond, the nearest creature lunged toward her. She was fast, faster than I expected. She ducked under its arm and grabbed something from her belt. It looked like a welding torch, but emitted a bright, concentrated beam that sliced through the creature's arm like butter. The severed limb hit the floor with a wet, metallic thud. "Lucas, right?" she said, breathless. "Can you move?" I blinked. "What the hell is happening?" "No time for introductions. Do you want to live or not?" "Yeah, that'd be great." She pressed something on the table and the restraints released. I scrambled to my feet, every muscle screaming in protest. The creature she'd attacked let out a sound like static on a dying radio. The others began to close in. "We've got maybe 2 minutes before they adapt," she said, shoving the torch into my hands. "Don't miss." "What is this?" "Plasma cutter. Point and burn." The creatures advanced, their metallic bodies shifting and twisting like liquid. One of them lunged, and I swung the torch wildly. The beam cut across its torso, splitting it in two. The halves dissolved into a puddle of viscous silver goo. "This is not how I thought my Tuesday was going to go," I muttered. "Welcome to my world," she shot back, pulling something from her pocket. It looked like a handheld detonator. She pressed the button, and part of the wall disintegrated, revealing a narrow corridor. "Move!" she yelled, dragging me forward. We ran. The corridor twisted and turned like a maze, every surface glowing faintly. The sound of the creatures echoed behind us, a relentless, mechanical hiss. My lungs burned, but adrenaline kept me moving. "What are they?" I panted. "Ceres," she said. "Artificial life forms." "Not the time for a history lesson," I snapped. "What do they want?" "Biological data. They're mapping us, our species, our weaknesses. You were just next on the list." "Great. So how do we stop them?" "We don't," she said grimly. "We escape, and if we're lucky, we take a few of them out on the way." The corridor opened into a massive chamber. In the center was a platform with what looked like a control panel. She sprinted toward it, her fingers flying over strange, glowing symbols. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Reprogramming their navigation system. If I can override it, I can send this whole damn ship into a star." "That's comforting," I said dryly. "Got a better idea?" I didn't. The Ceres burst into the chamber, their bodies flowing and reforming as they moved. I activated the plasma cutter, swinging it in wide arcs. 2 of them fell, their forms collapsing into pools of shimmering liquid. "Hurry up!" I shouted. "I'm working on it!" she snapped. One of the Ceres reached for her, its needle-like arm extending. I didn't think. I just moved. The plasma cutter sliced through its torso and it crumbled, but not before another one grabbed my leg. "Cover your ears," she said. "What?" The blast was deafening. When the light cleared, the Ceres were gone and she was dragging me to my feet. "We've got 30 seconds, she said. "To what?" "Run." We sprinted. The ship trembled. A portal opened. "You first," she said. I dove through. A moment later we were back in the field. The sky was eerily quiet. "Who are you?" I asked. She hesitated, then smiled. "Let's just say I'm not from around here." Before I could press her further, a distant rumble shook the ground. I looked up just in time to see a bright flash in the sky, followed by a streak of light plunging toward the horizon. "What was that?" I asked. "Their ship," she said, "or what's left of it." I nodded, unsure what to say. She turned to leave, but I grabbed her arm. "Wait, why were they doing this? What's their endgame?" "They're scouts," she said, "the first wave. If they'd finished their work, the next wave wouldn't be far behind. And now we've bought some time, but they'll be back." She walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for a long time, staring at the horizon. My bin was still standing, the ham radio untouched on the bench, but everything else had changed. Later that week, I found strange markings burned into the dirt where the sites had stood. Symbols, like a warning. I didn't know what they meant, but I had a feeling I wasn't done with them yet.